Session is being started. Good morning and Jaina everyone. I am Dr. Kalpana Yadav, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, Banaras Hindu University. So first of all, I would like to invite all the dignitaries to please come on the dais. Uh, Chair Professor Prasenjit Vishwas, Sir uh, Bhaskar Jeet Niyog, Dr. Bhaskar Jeet Niyog, Manas Jyoti Deka, Dr. Manas Jyoti Deka, and Sanjeet Chakravarti. Please come. What happened? As we know that this session is being presided by Professor Prasenjit Vishwas. So first of all, let me give a brief introduction of the chair. Professor Prasenjit Vishwas is a professor of philosophy at Northeastern Hill University, Shillong. Professor Vishwas obtained his PhD from Northeastern Hill University. He was formerly with the Indian Schools of Mines, Dhanbad, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, and Assam University, Silchar. His research interests reflect an interdisciplinary orientation that includes ethnophilosophy, ethnicity, and indigenous identities. He is also a human rights defender who works with Barak Human Rights Protection Committee, Silchar. He specializes in continental philosophy and phenomenology. He has worked on post-Marxist thoughts and currently exploring the notion of aporia in social theory. So I request Professor Prasenjit Vishwas to conduct the program. Please come, sir.
Uh, Good morning, Dr. Yadav, for giving this alluring introduction to today's proceedings, as well as a little bit about me as well, for which I express my hearty thanks to you. I also thank Dr. Rahul Moria for holding such an important conference at this point of time, where there are lots of new debates that are coming in the area of language, truth, and reality, especially from the point of view of post-analytic, post-continental kind of philosophy. So therefore, this conference is going to make a mark, I'm sure, in terms of some new explorations that are already happening in many of these papers. So this morning, we have this, I would say, this exploratory and yet very germane kind of a panel that takes into account certain aspects of the relationship between truth and reality. And the perspectives are also very, very diverse. I can see here Sanjeet, I can see here Manush, and I can, of course, see Bhaskar Jyoti. All three have three different standpoints in philosophy. And therefore, I expect that there will be diverse epistemological positionings, and these positionings would generate a certain kind of debate and a certain kind of, once again, an exploratory interest, all of which can finally converge into our own take on these new developments in language, truth, and reality. So, our first speaker this morning is Bhaskarjit Niog. Uh, Dr. Bhaskarjit Niog, whom I know very in the first person, therefore I would go by the name Bhaskarjit or Bhaskar. He was in my native place. He started his career from Silchar, And we are very happy that he started his career from Assam University, Silchar. And then he moved on to JNU, of course, as a faculty. But prior to that, he had this transcontinental exposure. He was in Linköping. He was also in Utrecht. He was in IIT Kanpur. And he has this multiple exposures to the contemporary debates and discussions in philosophy of mind, language, social epistemology, and some other burgeoning fields of philosophy in which he is working pretty well. His recent work on the idea of responsibility for a genocide and collective intentionality had acquired a certain kind of a focus, and it is read with a lot of interest. So, therefore, without standing between you and all of you, him and all of you, I leave the floor to Bhaskar for his presentation. I think we will be having 20 minutes for presentation, 20 minutes for presentation, and rest of the time can be for discussion. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Right. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Uh, Thank you, Rahul, for organizing this important conference and giving us this opportunity to come here to this beautiful campus. I think I must begin by confessing at the outset that I don't have a full paper with me. I couldn't manage to get one. What I have here is a bunch of stray thoughts about two prominent theses, moral relativism and moral realism, in the study of philosophical study of morals. Although they are not very well connected, I hope they will add up to something which I have been trying to sort of pursue for quite some time, namely to undermine these diametrically opposed position, moral relativism and moral realism, and to try to sort of, in a way, as I said, undermine and weaken their positional incongruity, and also to negotiate a path through two theses, which I call disputation thesis, the first one, and then the second one is a relative truth thesis. So my aim is pretty generic in the sense that I'm not going to make very specific comments. I think it was Wilfred Seller who once said that philosophy is all about understanding how things in the broadest possible sense hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So here, the same spirit, I'm going to understand how things about these uh, two positions or two theses in the broadest possible sense of the terms hang together in the broadest possible sense of these two terms. That might sound pretty broad, but I hope I'll be able to rationalize them within certain boundaries without really distorting the term boundary. So the objective of the paper is not very new. Many have tried this before, and some have succeeded, others haven't. But I'm indebted to all of them for making me, understand the depth of this two positions. Uh, I haven't done metaphysics for quite some time. It's been 5 years or so. One of the reasons that I find metaphysics very tiring is that it involves a hell lot of typology and definitions and categorization. You want to make a claim, a small claim, you will have to engage in making lots of distinction and categorization, and this is something that's going to happen into this presentation as well. The second important thing that I should highlight right in the beginning is that I'm going to talk about Jaina metaphysics or Jainism, Jaina realism in a very sort of very briefly. I'm not going to really make any detailed comment. There are important people and more, better people to make comments on Jaina metaphysics. But I hope my aim is to just to show that how Jainism could be very, very relevant in understanding and grappling with the compatibility issue of these two, doctrinal position called moral realism and moral relativism. Uh, so I was talking about this, the incompatibility issue that these two positions have, and this is something that has been highlighted quite appropriately in the first session itself, in yesterday. And this position, this incompatibility issue arises because these two positions are quite different. There's a schism, well-known schism between them. And this is from David Ring in a 1989 paper. He said, moral relativism is usually understood as a denial of realism and objectivity about truth. Carol Rovain, also yesterday, Professor Bilgrami was talking about Rovain's position in this regard. Rovain also pretty clearly mentioned this in her book, in 2013 book on relativism, that there is a long-standing assumption that relativism and realism are mutually opposed, and that there cannot be any real bridge between them. So the incompatibility between these two positions is quite well known, uh, and and so this is where I come in. My aim is to see where I can undermine this incompatibility, where I can weaken their contrasting spirits and say something meaningful about both the position by subscribing to a position called two theses basically. One is disputation thesis and the other is relative truth thesis. What about these two positions? What are the definitional aspects of these two positions? The first one is about moral realism. Moral realism is about a realist position that moral facts are real. They are as real as natural facts. But then, because they have mind-independent existence, and they are not the byproduct of our actual societal beliefs and practices, and that they enjoy a very special status in the world of facts. Of course, they are not like natural facts on a number of for a number of reasons, because you cannot really see them. They are not out there. You'll have to find them by by certain process, by deliberation and reflection. Moral relativism, on the other hand, is about it suggests that truth and falsity, right and wrong, permissibility and impermissibility of moral judgments and their justification are an important and non-negligible sense, socially and culturally constructed, and thus they are relative to tradition, conviction, and perhaps and practices of a group of persons or community. Right. So this is how these two positions can be understood, and this is how they are quite opposite to each other. Now, here, what I want to pursue is this: how these two positions come to stand against each other so as to raise a huge compatibility issue between them, and to understand what is it about these two positions that makes them so diametrically opposed to each other, that there cannot be any bridge, that there cannot be any interaction between these two positions. So this is what I want to pursue here. This is the fundamental question that I want to pursue here. With the help of these two theses that I call disputation thesis and relative truth thesis. This disputation thesis, yesterday Professor Bilgrami was talking about, but he was using the term contradiction. And I have some issues with that term. And some people use it as disagreement thesis. I'm using the term disputation thesis for a number of reasons. I'm not going to talk about that. But the thesis in its simple terms suggests that the heart of relativism actually lies in the possibility of a dispute between these two parties, a dispute that cannot be reasonably resolved. And neither of the view can be reasonably rejected given the compelling strength of the moral contents in the constitution of their claims. Because both the claims are so very compelling that you cannot really say that one is true and the other is false. Both the moral claims are true in that sense. And that's why there is a huge dispute between these two. And if you take this disputation thesis really very seriously, and it can take a very strong, it can take a very stronger shape when both the parties are even ready to acknowledge what the other position is saying, and then that the opponent can be right, even though they think otherwise. That's where it gets really, really very tricky. Even if they know that, even if they are saying that the other party is not right, yet one might be very generous and say that I can understand what the other party is saying, but I don't agree with that, right? And that's where it gets really very strong. And the relative truth thesis is very simple, and it involves two claims. The first one is that there is no absolute truth about any moral claims, and this is exactly where realism denies, and that each relevant moral claim is true only relatively. That means truths are relative. And these theses, I'll try to basically suggest that this thesis can be interpreted in terms of two claims. The first is relativism simpliciter and degree of truth thesis. So these are the two theses that you can talk about when you talk about the relative truth thesis. Relativism simpliciter, relativism as such, and degree of truth. Now there are three. When you talk about relativism, this is where things are not very clear to us. Most of the time, we don't pay adequate attention to different varieties of relativism that we have. So here, and then there are always things are not always very clear about them. And my attempt here is to highlight, or at least to try to find out at least three different relativist claims, and to suggest that only two are really very strong, and there's no question of compatibility when you talk about it in terms of realism. But there's one version where we have some avenues to do so. The first one is really very strict in the sense that this disputation thesis really holds on really very strongly, and it talks about relativism simpliciter. So it can be a relativist by being on the grounds of your subjective understanding. Subjectivity could well be the ground of that form of relativism. And non-cognitivism, expressivism, emotivism, they can be categorized under this category because there are no moral truths, and there's no question of any moral facts. And definitely moral agreements and disagreements are always about subjective approval and disapproval, because it's always about your understanding. This is how the non-cognitivist or emotivist would suggest that these are just expression of your emotions when you make a moral statement or moral judgment. And I have some response, because I think that's not a really very strong a relativist claim, because the disputation thesis might even it holds, and that suggests that it is authentic relativist, but then without any reasonable complaint, in the sense that the other party cannot have a reasonable complaint about your statement when that party disagrees with you. And because it becomes what I call, it's a view about morality where morality tastes like a chocolate. Suppose you say that I love chocolate and I say that I love coffee, there is no disagreement, right? There is no question of any disagreement. Apparently, there is a disagreement that both are fighting with each other, but then I don't have any reasonable complaint to make about you. Why do you like chocolate? You like chocolate, you like chocolate, and that's the end of the matter, right? And so the idea is that there is no reasonable complaint that one party could make against the other, and that's the problem. And it cannot really, that's the reason it cannot really articulate the core of the disputation thesis, or so I suggest. The second one is pretty interesting, and that's where it gets really very tricky, and this is the most, perhaps the sophisticated one, and many, including Gilbert Farman, Bernard Williams, seem to suggest this, seem to subscribe to this form of relativism. And this is how it goes. This is again, the disputation thesis holds on. It's very clear about it. There is no agreement. There is going to be a dispute between these two parties. And then the one party cannot really make a reasonable complaint against the other. And this is how it is stronger than the first one. When I say certain things are right, my statement is elliptical. What I am really saying is that according to the system of morality in my culture, this action is right. You do not agree with this because this is not how you see according to the norms of your culture, and thus you think this is wrong. And this is really very sort of, this is where the disputation thesis holds on really strongly. And there is no compatibility question there, because both can be right and about their claims equally compellingly. But then there are issues, as I suggest, that it's possible that these two persons have attitudes and interests that conflict with each other. However, upon close introspection, their respective judgments are descriptive in nature, not really normative. They're not, when you talk about their quality, they are not really normative in nature. The judgments as such cannot conflict in the way the judgments issued from different moral universe can do. Their incompatibility, the second point, works only at a practical level. This practical conflict is rendered possible by the fact that these normative judgments have not only truth condition, but satisfaction condition as well. And that's where the disputation thesis really holds on. The second response that I have, and this is where I think this is exactly the argument that Professor Pradhan was also making yesterday, but here I'm making it with the help of the idea called tolerance. Whenever you talk about this, whenever you subscribe to this form of relativism, you invoke tolerance. You both can be right, and you shouldn't be worried about it, because we ought to tolerate others' culture, other cultures' moral perspective. But then it also has the second claim, which it often makes. It suggests that moral terms like right just mean right for a given society. In other words, right for them. So there are two parts of this of their claim, but then that's where the problem lies. The problem is this: in saying that we ought to tolerate the other's culture, implicitly suggests that we are ready to endorse a universal, non-relative moral claim. Tolerance appears to be a non-relative moral claim there, right? And that's why you ought to moral claim, because it's not a non-relative moral claim, namely that we should tolerate the views of the other. But then the problem here is that when you say that all moral terms, the problem lies with the second part. When you say, yeah, thanks, 6 minutes to 20 minutes. Okay. When I say all moral terms like right, wrong, tolerance are right and a given from a given society's point of view, will not be allowing any non-moral, non-relative moral claims. And if this is so, then the invocation of tolerance doesn't really logically sustain. And that's where it becomes self-defeating. And that is the inconsistency problem that this particular position has. The third one, which is what I am going to support, is soft, but yet it's very interesting. The first two are really strong insofar as their relativist, the disputation thesis is concerned. So it's possible that when two persons make one person makes a certain moral judgment such that the action is right, and another person belonging to another culture makes that the judgment of the very same action is wrong. They may have good reasons to do so, but then and they can also see what the other person is saying and visualize the rationale behind what the other person is saying. But then they are ready to accept, and this is where I make a difference between believing and accepting. You may not really believe it what the other person is saying, but you may take a cognitive stance of accepting what the other person says, right? When you believe when you have a belief about something, you accept what it is. But when you accept it, you need not really believe in it. That's the important distinction. So this is where it is soft in the sense because there are avenues. The disputation thesis apparently remains, but one becomes ready to accept the other slowly because the other slowly comes in terms to the other's position. The disputation thesis, in a way, slowly loses its strength as the epistemological grounds become clear to the other party. Now, about what about the relativism, realism? Because as I defined, realism is very clear about the reality of moral facts. But then their claims are very different from the realist of a natural fact. Skip this. But when you sorry. Oops. Really, I'm finishing it in 3 minutes. Yeah. Yes. So, when you talk about moral facts, these moral facts can be there can be a good analogy between mathematics and moral facts. Because there's this venerable tradition that draws to this parallel between morality and mathematics, because the reality of moral facts and and matters are just like facts of mathematics. This parallel even is found in the works of Plato, as I said, suggested. But then they are different. Yeah, but when you talk about moral reality of moral facts, you don't need to be really a singularist. I mean, this is where the problem lies. The conflict arises when you start invoking singularism with respect to the reality of moral facts. While moral realist position is a defensible position, they need not take a singularist turn. Singularism suggests there is only one, as I said, only one a set of moral standards for everyone, and everyone must go by that. But I mean, there are two rings to it. One is metaphysical thesis, and the other is the epistemological thesis. And I'm not going to talk about that. But and this is where things become very clear how Jaina could become very handy, because Jaina also talks about moral realism when it talks about the elephant. When there are debates going on between these people, they are relatively they are relative insofar as the truth claims that they are making with respect to their point of view. right? One is touching the tail, one is touching the feet. They have different points of view, but all these points of view can be true only when there is an elephant, and the reality of elephant is not denied, right? Similar, I think, position can be maintained, and the realists can take. This is where the epistemic grounds become very important, because these individuals have to be ready to accept what the other person is saying, and thereby developing a tendency to sort of to have what the to open to have an open-mindedness insofar as the other's understanding of the reality is concerned. And but a few other things that, but I'm not going to talk about it, but I just want to conclude by saying that the two things that that are very important to note here. One is about this invocation of the value of tolerance. The invocation of value of tolerance is not a good reason for a relativist to say that there is only one, there are different multiple realities. We saw that how this leads to inconsistent position for the relativists. In the second case, we saw that. But more than that, we must note that allowing tolerance must not make us morally insouciant. It shouldn't give you that that route for being indifferent about the other if the other is really, really wrong about a particular moral claim. And this is where perhaps we see the import of the moral realist claim about moral facts, because you talk, moral relativism cannot be cannot be sort of given this space, because it gives you the option of tolerance. Tolerance is fine, but then one has to maintain a realist position, and that's where because tolerance can take you to that indifferent side. You can be very indifferent if something really terribly happens, because you think the other person has a right to do that, and you don't have a legitimate moral claim to make about it. And that is disastrous, and that's where it should stop. I think tolerance is the value of tolerance is not a good excuse. The other thing is about Harman. I think this is something that I've been thinking about it, and I also wrote it in my book. And I think the problem with Harman is that uh, 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 is that Harman suggests that our moral judgment, that our judgments about how people ought to act or which actions are wrong are relativized to groups that they have formed agreements or have come to understanding with each other. He gives the example of merchants and a band of cannibals and a mob-like group called Murder Incorporated. He thinks that whatever we might say of members of these groups, that they are wrong, unjust, and so on, we really fall short of saying that they ought not to do that, or they ought not to kill others, and that is wrong for them to do so. And this is, I think, is really, really unacceptable, because what perhaps Harman is suggesting that it's a moral claim for the members of those groups. It's an internal claim, and this internal claim with respect to that group is not a moral claim. It may have that normative power to bind the people within that group, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a moral claim. And this is where I think Harman gets things wrong. And because I often give this example of this money heist. When you must have watched that beautiful series where the professor and the other people are doing something illegal. They know, and there is an obligation that, and also the other party is entitled to rebuke if the other person, if you are not following what the other party is saying. So there's mutual obligation and mutual entitlement insofar as their objective of their desired action is concerned. But to say that these individuals are making moral claims over the other is wrong. They may be making a normative claim because of the agreement that has taken place, but they are not really making any moral claim. right? And that can be detected only when you subscribe to the realist thesis. Thank you. Thanks so much.
So thank you, Bhaskar, for presenting this contemporary and very contemporary shades of debate between moral realism and moral relativism. And a lot of questions are raised instead of answering those questions. And one of the major questions that comes to my mind from what he has said is this idea of believing in a certain moral norm and accepting it, while there is an epistemic disagreement about this moral norm. Now, a thesis that he tried to maintain obliquely is that there is an epistemic ground for a moral belief or a moral norm. Now, the question is there an epistemic ground for a moral claim, moral norm, or a moral principle even? I know. So that hangs out as a major question from this whole debate. So I think we should have a short discussion on this paper right now itself before it vaporizes into thin air. So maybe another 15 minutes, let's discuss this. So let's start. Yes, Professor Rakesh Chandra.
I was just wondering that, in some categorization, I think we have loved enough. Yeah, Bhaskajit. So I was just wanting your attention to two small things. One, in some of our discussions, we make the opposition between relativism and absolutism, realism and constructivism, objectivism and subjectivism. And realism, moral realism, would be then contrasted with moral constructivism, and moral relativism will be contrasted with moral absolutism, and the identification of relativism always with constructivism would need an argument, because you may be a realist against a constructivist, and there yet you may be an objectivist as well as an absolutist. So what you have in the very beginning done is to identify all moral relativism with constructivist theory needs an argument. Because even with moral realism, it could be possible that you are an absolutist or you may be a relativist. They may be generally that kind of position. I would like your response to that. The other question was that when you're in your discussion of tolerance, I was wondering that there are many from Kant to Gandhi who consider tolerance to be a bad thing. That because you have already made a judgment about negative judgment that you are not right, yet I'm only tolerating you. And therefore, you remember, famously in Kant, he makes a distinction between tolerance as a personal virtue, as an interpersonal virtue, and then in terms of a political. And he said that for personal purposes, tolerance is a good idea because it helps you to endure. In interpersonal relationship, it manifests as etiquette. But otherwise, it is actually not a good thing to tolerate, because to tolerate means that you are actually judging the person negatively already. So how would you respond to that kind of a discussion as you move this all and you think that, tolerance is actually a certain kind of an acceptance without believing in terms of the
Yeah,
moral?
thanks. I think I would consider the latter as a comment, because that's exactly what I'm saying. Tolerance is not a good thing all the time. I mean, it looks great when you talk about its virtues, that you ought to be tolerant about others' culture, others' practices. But then when the others' practices is so visibly wrong to you, there is going to be it's going to be terrible if you keep quiet and say nothing about it. So if tolerance is the virtue, and that virtue in a way gives us this justification, or in a way it legitimizes moral relativism position, I'm not with that. And that's exactly what you were also highlighting, and I'm pretty clear about that. And that's what many relativists sort of suggest, that this is something that's great, and that's why you need to be a bit sort of you should be always ready to accept what the other person is saying. But that's fine with respect to certain things, but not always. With respect to the first question, I'm not sure I really got it. What I'm saying is that moral. So when you talk about constructivist, what kind of constructivism that we have in mind? We can talk about social contract theory, right? Agreement. By agreement, you all come to accept that these are things that are good for us, and let's practice it, right? So it's not an absolutist position for sure, because you agree to accept certain things. You may not really believe in those things, because there's a contract between the people, and that's why you ought to accept it. And that's how I understand constructivism, right? In the broader sense of the term. So relativist in that sense is a constructivist, and in a way,
No,
you want to
my
intersect?
point
Yeah.
was just a small. No, it's not an argument. The point was realism. Realism opposition to constructivism is to be understood in terms of realism conventionalism.
Yeah, realism in the absolute sense.
Relativism will be only contrasted with absolutism.
Yes, I disagree with that, because I'm not talking about absolutism when I'm talking about moral realism, and that's why I'm against singularism, right? Absolutism is equivalent to singularism in some sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Plain. Non-cognitivists actually try to avoid the question of truth or falsity vis-a-vis moral judgments, because moral judgments are emotive or expressive in nature. And therefore, the question of, in a way, they could avoid the debate between realism and relativism by saying, moral statements do not actually talk about fact of the matter, but they express our beliefs. So if you are going to put them in the relativist camp, then you have to say why this kind of expression or expression of our emotions. What is the relativist grasp of it? This is one thing. Another thing is that when you brought in the example of the Jaina, that example of touching the elephant and making judgments about what we feel or what we see by our touch. There is this idea of perspectivalism, that we are looking at it from different perspectives. And all the perspectives, in fact, are perspectives of something. So there is an objective fact of the matter, but when we are looking at it, we are looking at it from different points of views, as it were. So relativism is not just looking at from different points of views, isn't it? I think what Professor Bilgrami was saying, that relativism comes into play when these different points of view clash. They contradict with each other.
Yes, I wasn't very sure about the contradiction part. Let me first respond to your initial point. Yes, you are absolutely right. They are not relativists in the strict sense of the term, but they are nihilist. They do not really believe in the reality of moral facts, so they are nihilist. But they they do share, emotivists do have that same understanding insofar as the subjectivist explanation of moral facts are concerned. So to the extent they are subjectivist, it's fair to give a level of relativism to an extent in a very loose form. I'm not saying that that can be defended. I'm saying that there can be a relativist who can take a position like that, and that is not a defensible and a good relativist position. So I am not really saying that the emotivists are relativists, or they have a position, or they have an official take on relativism. I'm just talking about the shared understanding of the subjectivist point of view, which a relativist, a true relativist would hold, and an emotivist would also go by that. To that extent, they are relativists, but they are not officially relativists. You are absolutely right. The second point, yes, indexical, right? The point of view, your point of view. Uh, yes, I mean, this is where things become very sort of. It depends how sophisticated you are with your relativist claim. I mean, I must confess that I have not been able to take it to that sort of level where, I mean, people like Rovain would talk about at the metaphysical level. I leave it things at the epistemological level. So one of our major attempts is to show that relativist claim can hold on even at the metaphysical level. And that's the success of this story. So against that background, if you are judging me, I accept that this has not gone that far because I have not developed it up to that standard. I agree, and I do see the point there. Yeah.
Reconcile both the positions. I think this is, if I understand you correctly, one of your intentions in the paper, that one can be a realist while being a relativist. If that position you are taking, then this may be again impossible to achieve, precisely because if a realist is committed to moral truths and moral facts, then the relativist cannot really digest it. It can only say that these moral facts are really no facts at all. So they will have a no fact theory. Or
Then
no
they
fact,
become nihilist.
yeah, they will be, they're not committed to that. Whereas the realist is committed. Like the yesterday, Professor Bilgrami talked about cruelty. So he'll say, I don't see any cruelty there, or there is no cruelty as a moral value or disvalue. So in that sense, I think both positions will remain
Where
if
they
they
are.
are taken seriously
Yeah.
opposed to each other.
Yes, but it all depends what kind of relativism that you endorse. There are certain relativist positions which are not defensible, and that's one of the major tasks of this paper. That they are blatantly wrong. Let's accept it, and that's what my main purpose is. That there are some relativist claims which are really, really wrong, and to say that this is the good reason to say reason to talk about the negation of moral realism. It's not going to work because that's not good enough to rebut moral realism. And this is something goes in the same direction that we were talking about truths. With respect to moral truths, I think we have the same sort of spirit, whether it's a moral truth or natural truth. Spirit is same. The inspiration, the urge is same, and this is where I think realist wins the game, because if you put emphasis on that urge, really everyone wants to get things right, and that's where it is normative. Normatively, it is pretty. It's going towards the direction of realism and uh, 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 truth claims, that expression. So that's how I see this debate. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Professor Yogi, when you think, in view of your discussion on this, the opposition that you placed, if you feel it is so superfluous uh, that it can be compromised, that is one thing to say, and by being compromising, if you bring the concept of tolerance, which looks like charity to me, because when you come from listening to the ground reality, we are proposing, and in the women's, because women are always excluded. So the theory of inclusivity, like the transgenders, they are. It is kind of a tolerance which is applied to them, which is very dehumanizing. They are just tolerated. No, you just ask them what do they want, why do they want to be men or women, why would we ask them that, what is the opposition? So if your theory is applicable universally, then it has to be applicable to these groups of people whom we have included.
Yeah.
And then we have proposed that the theory of inclusivity must bring them as
Yeah. Yeah.
as being, as existing, as humans, and leave the understanding of whatever gender it is, third, fourth, and these are the terms which are very dehumanizing. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think this gives me the sort of opportunity to highlight one of the things that I really wanted to say towards the end, but I couldn't. It's the pluralist position, multiplicity of moral facts and their truth claims. So that's why the rejection of singularism becomes very, very important. You don't just recognize that they are and othering is another issue with tolerance. When you say that I am going to tolerate this and this is fine, I'm ready to tolerate, you are actually starting to otherize the other. And this is where the problem is, that moral realist, in the strict sense of the term, that thesis doesn't really provoke you to be a singularist, provoke you to say, let's accept this one culture, one universe, one system of norms kind of thing. And that's exactly where Matilal was talking about and saying things against nationalists and jingoists. This is where things become very, very ugly. And so that's the problem, is that, and this is where this position becomes very, very, it's very close to David Roth and others, multiple moral truths at the same time. So you really do not have to tolerate the other. I mean, that's a bad argument, I would say, even though tolerance as such is a great value. It's a great value to tolerate the other. And that's what we have been always taught, right? But then that's not a good excuse for the relativist to suggest that this is going to make you tolerant. Then it's not a good argument. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. So actually, I'm little bit annoyed with the very khichdi that pluralistic, thinkers
Yeah, I
propose.
heard that term yesterday
Yeah.
also.
So the idea is like that. On the one hand, you are saying that moral facts are much more like mathematical facts. We haven't taken any kind of concern or permission from mathematicians. Mathematicians are singularists, and you claim that moralists cannot be singularist in a mathematical sense. So this is a very bad idea. Like, I want to say, ultimately we have to found a foundation like intuition to make sense of realism. The way soteriologists like K.C. Bhattacharya would say that logic is a good idea to understand the idea of absolute, but without revelation it is not possible. Likewise, the idea of understanding the moral truth is good through logic, through reasoning, but without intuition, I do not think we would ever be able to establish such kind of thing, because we ultimately find a mess that we create with the so-called term like toleration, pluralism, and so on. So,
I get it.
so it
Yeah.
is neither fitting the law of any laws of thought, neither it is fitting the any kind of intellectual integrity with which we can
I
be
may ask-
happy about.
That he's not making at all any such point about he is saying that it is not a mathematical nature of reality that we discuss in morality. Now, what is the mathematical nature of reality? Mathematics doesn't go for singularity at all at this point of time, as you know.
That's a wrong claim. And,
And mathematicians do tolerate, each other's falsifications. Every mathematician tries to falsify the other, and it goes on in mathematics, if you have looked at current form of mathematics. So that metaphor will not be appropriate. Nevertheless, you have a point, and to which Bhaskar can respond.
I'm not sure when you say that intuitions are not, mathematicians don't use intuitions. I'm not sure about that. I cannot give you a good rebuttal without really, but that's something. Yeah, why not? The intuition is not available to that. So this is, I wanted to suggest this book that has just come in, I think just last year. It's by somebody called Justin Clark Dawn from Colombia. Yesterday I had a talk with Bill Grammy, and it's a fantastic book. And the book is about this analogy, morality and mathematics. I mean, you don't really have literally, you don't have to really take it literally that moral facts are mathematical facts. Nobody's saying that. But insofar as their status of, is concerned, their status is somewhat similar to mathematical facts. And that's what the claim is all about. Nothing more, nothing less. You don't really have to say that they are mathematical facts. That will be a very bad understanding, I think. Nobody is saying that moral facts are mathematical facts or they are identical with mathematical facts. But the manner in which you arrive at a mathematical fact is somewhat similar to the way you arrive at a moral fact. Reflection, deliberation, and if you have good reasons, you can arrive at it. You can see why it is cruel. You can make the other person see why it is cruel. Right? And that's, provability is not a good argument. I mean, there are people who say that no, mathematical truths can be proved, whereas moral truths cannot be proved. That's not a good argument. And I would definitely recommend this book. The first chapter itself, it says that that's quite clear. Thanks.
So I thank Bhaskar for giving good ideas and responses to a big hand for Bhaskar. Yeah. Now, next speaker is equally alluring because he is expounding on Jacques Lacan and his notions of the idea of real in terms of language and truth. And this is Dr. Manasjyoti Deka, who holds a PhD from JNU. He was a postdoctoral fellow of ICSSR New Delhi, has taught in JNU Zakir Hussain College and Karimganj College of Assam University, and currently he is in Sipajhar College of Guwahati University. He has been a visiting fellow to Thammasat University, to Chiang Mai University, to Mahachakri Sridharan Anthropology Center, Cultural Institute of Bangkok, University of Phayao, and also at Kachar College at Assam University. He has been working on philosophy of psychoanalysis for quite some time. So I request Dr. Manoj to present his paper.
Thank you, sir. I thank Rahul for giving me this opportunity. He is not present, I think. And okay. Oh, I didn't see you. Okay. And congratulate Philosophy Department BHU for organizing this kind of a conference. It's not a comparative study between Jacques Lacan's theories and Jainism. I'm trying to see Jainism through the prism of Lacanian categories and vice versa. And before I start, I think that I should give just a little introduction, brief introduction to some of Lacanian categories I'm going to use, because you may not be very familiar with. So Lacan talks about subjectivity through three psychological orders: imaginary, symbolic, and real. And these orders are constructed or held together by a concept called symptom. I will come to that part. So imaginary is that domain before language encroaches a subject. It constructs, helps the ego that gives the sense of an I-ness through a dialectical process of identification. It works as a small other to subjectivity. The ego remains an other, according to Lacan. And symbolic is that what makes a subject in terms of culture or language, which works as the big other. So culture or language is an other to subjectivity. And real is what is left beyond the symbolic imaginary reality. That what cannot be captured by language, something remains always. Uh, what is foreclosed from the point of view of reality. So real will always be lurking outside our so-called reality. Okay. According to Jaina Anakantavada, if there exists a world or loka, there has to exist an anti-world or a loka. This is from this book, Anakanto, the third eye. Anekantavada as such is the immanent ground for Syadvada. Just like physical positive force cannot exist without the negative one, existence of something compels an anti-existence or contradictory existence of that very thing. In that case, it has to be understood that existence of something exists only because its opposite, that is anti-existence of the very thing, also exists. Here, existence of something does not establish the non-existence of the thing, as the emphasis lies on the thing only. However, the logic of Anekantavada must also go with the interpretation that if the question is the very existence itself, that is, the existence of the existence itself, then the opposite of it must be non-existence. That is, the existence of the non-existence. Now, existence exists definitely as an immanent principle of this world. Hence, non-existence too must exist, although as a transcendent principle of this very world. Psychoanalysis often brings in an anti-philosophy to philosophy, in the sense that what our conscious mind reflects consciously, philosophically in this sense, may be sprouted off a board of unconsciousness. Philosophy of consciousness has every right to be allergic to philosophy of psychoanalysis, a reflective anti-reflection that tends to question the whole philosophical enterprise if thoughts happened under the compulsion of some superegoic id unconsciousness. As such, philosophy of psychoanalysis coerces any serious reflection to examine itself along with the ongoing reflection. If we see it from the perspective of Anekantavada, then this anti-reflection through psychoanalysis must also ontologically must exist ontologically in order for the philosophical reflection to exist in its first place. Therefore, looking Jainism through the prism of philosophy of psychoanalysis and vice versa is highly Jainist
at the very immanent level of philosophizing. Thus, if we pose a question like, can we compare Lacanian psychoanalytic theories and Jain's philosophy? The obvious answer would be definitely a yes. Of course, they are from different cultural background, yet it is the task of philosophy to do the impossible. A comparison between these two makes this task highly philosophical in the sense that it calls for going beyond a certain boundary that tries to reach the universal. The task makes both the philosophies more universalizable. For example, if we randomly pick up a pebble on the road and ask a question, can I compare this pebble or stone with myself? The answer is a big yes. And this answer, in fact, gives birth to a certain kind of Sartrean existential philosophy. In fact, the very nature of Jainism itself calls for other trends to invoke philosophy in a singular way. The category of the unconscious real of Lacan as the necessary ground for any happening of philosophizing as conscious reflection of the symbolic imaginary order that creates reality is what Jainism offers to psychoanalysis as a thinking tool. From the Jain perspective, thus, we see symbolic imaginary reality cannot be actually the opposite of the real. It is because the reality as such springs out of the immanent ground of the real. Reality cannot be anti-real from the point of the real. Though from the stand of the reality, real can be an anti-reality and hence a necessary existence. For real is what intrudes or breaks the symbolic imaginary reality. It's a grimace of reality that lurks outside. What would be the antithesis of the real then following Jainism? An anti-real, an opposite of the real has to be the irreal. And here we see a new interpretation to what Lacan has said about the grimace of the real. According to Lacan, the grimace of the real is reality itself, because it is the symbolic of reality that cuts through the flesh of the real. However, if we take up Jain perspective seriously, the real has to, as its antithetical existence, have only the irreal. The irreal is then the ontological immanent ground, necessary condition for the real to exist in its first place. It has to be the case because, after all, real is also an order like symbolic and imaginary that clasps itself together to form the triad of subjectivity. The nature of real has to be similar to symbolic and imaginary to some extent in order to be a so-called order that mingles with or intrudes or affects the symbolic imaginary reality. However, irreal is not bound to any orderly logic or maxims that Lacan proposes. It exists with a triad, with the same logic that can be borrowed from Jainism. We may submit that symptom that binds this triad, that combines these three order together must be related to irreal only. Now a question regarding the nature of the anti-world or irreal props up. What can we say about the unspeakability of the unspeakable? What can be thought about the unthinkability of the unthinkable? Logically, whatever can be discussed or thought comes under the speakable or thinkable theoretically. Generally, this thinkable is the world, whether material or transcendental. For Lacan, this unthinkable is thought under the category of real, making the unthinkable thinkable. However, Jainism claims to be the only philosophy sprung out of Indian origin that tries to capture the thinkably unthinkable, that is, the anti-world. It says that our world, even if it is thinkably unthinkable, is governed by two principles, motion or gati, or rest or sthiti. Where motion and rest do not come into play is the anti-world. We know that motion is responsible for time and rest is for space. Rest is possible in a location, and locatedness of anything gives rise to the idea of space. And the change of location eventually brings in the idea of time. Hence, we may say that the anti-world in the anti-world, space and time do not come into play. Sure. Now, this is what is unconscious is all about from the Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective. Space and time do not work there as this work in the conscious world. Kantabada again says that anti-world is where the sentient and the insentient do not exist in union. In the anti-world, only the insentient rests, which invokes the discussion of the severing disjointed parts of the irreal of Lacan, where bodily parts float in separation as not a unified body apart from each other, talking about it from Deleuze's way of articulation of the real indifference in repetition. Now we can see that unspeakability of the unspeakable or unthinkability of the unthinkable is spoken or thought through the Syadbada. The singularity of one naya or perspective depends solely on the coexistence of the other nayas, whose coexistence is in fact a kind of non-existential existence. The whole logic is this: the presence of an existence is only thought or spoken when the existence or presence of the absence or non-existence of others can also be thought. In the manner that unspeakability of the unspeakable or the unthinkability of the unthinkable becomes an absent present or non-existential existent. The symbolic of language of the noyos that exists outside the presence of a singular perspective of consciousness captures this. With the help of this kind of interpretation, we may be able to understand how a parallax is possible due to Anekantabada only. Here we get another interpretation of Zizek's parallax view. The same object becomes different with different perspectives. For example, an object changes itself into another object if perspective changes itself from love to hatred, Jainism says. Thus, the epistemological shift causes an ontological shift in the object. This ontological shift transforms the object into what it is not. In other way, this challenge of epistemological perspective adds something into the very constitution of the object, and this addition is nothing but a form or lack in the that the subject as a perceiver brings into it. Therefore, because the subject herself is responsible to add this dimension to the object, the subject is also caught in by this lack or form of the object. This lack is nothing but the very object petty in Lacanian terminology, which is the anti-object from the Jain perspective. In Zizekian explanation, this becomes the example of object of love. The same ordinary object adds another dimension into its ontological constitution from the perspective of the subject, who is unaware of aiding it herself to the object. And after love happens, after the subject falls in love, the ordinary object all of a sudden becomes extraordinary as an object of love. In a way, the same object exists of itself. This is all about love till now. What happens to love when love fails miserably? When the subject of love turns to be the object of hatred or indifference? Or what happens when the extraordinary object loses its extraordinariness and becomes ordinary once again? In Jainism, when that object of love becomes the object of hatred, obviously and eventually an anti-object element is added to it. This anti-objectness that traps the subject with its empty form as a lack, in Julia Kristeva's psychoanalytic vocabulary, this anti-objectness, which is a part of the object and a part within and yet not part of the object, hence a part without, is captured by the category of abject. I will not go into the detail of this, so let me finish this. Sure. This is why all the Freudian categories like that of life instinct or death drive, pleasure and reality principle, introjection and projection, reaction formation and sublimation, etc. can be explained through Anekantavada. According to Freud, pleasure principle turns out to be reality principle when it confronts the symbolic of language that helps the demand of need to be postponed. This postponement creates desire because desire appears at the margin where demand is torn from the need. So, I actually, there was some explanation from Jain theory of language where word plays a role. Word was in the middle of the subjectivity and the world, and it really can be related to psychoanalytic explanation of the word. And Jainism rejects the discussion of this photo as the transcendental ground of word or language. And there actually Lacanian concept of jouissance also very much comes into play. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Maybe maximum 2 questions, please. If anybody has a comment or a question to make, let's start with. Yeah, please.
Hello. Sir, how do you establish anti-real when we compare it to non-real? Because is it a kind of a logical set, like a null set, or it is a metaphysical or ontological entity? When you say anti-real, how is it different from non-real? Is it logical or is it metaphysical?
Actually, I didn't use the word anti-real and even non-real. But I use the word anti-world, and that is used by Jainism, Jain text itself. So anti-real can be thought as something as a null set actually, the first signifier. It can be thought. Otherwise, you just cannot speak of it. Yes.
Or thinkers are silent. So there is a story that when Buddhist and Nyaya used to have a debate, so Buddhist usually left some debates in silence, and it was very much insulting for the Nyaya. In the same manner, when a continental kind of topic is being put forth in a discussion, not, and when analytic thinkers are situated in a realm, how do you look at it? Like, do you decode their silence? Are they misinterpreting you? Aren't they taking you seriously? Or whatever you want to say?
Actually, I didn't have enough time to elaborate. I should have gone into the details of the paper and explaining what were the categories. Actually, categories, if explained, anybody can understand first, because categories or concepts are the tools through which you think. So I'm extremely sorry that I could. And Lacanian psychoanalysis is really difficult. Actually, it's very dense, and it cannot be put onto the plate to consume just like that. Yeah, of course. But yeah, as bringing in Bilgami's suggestion that there should be a conversation, of course, from different perspective, and otherwise everything falls apart. Yeah.
We will now cut short this whole thing. I'll
Sure.
thank you from my part for presenting significantly the notion of symptom and also connecting it to some of the contemporary debates about how do we look at actual states of affairs, how do we look at actually possible states of affairs, how do we look at possibly impossible states of affairs, and how do we look at something that is thoroughly impossible in an absolute term. So Laka also takes an Onikantobadin line in his various seminars, which you have brought out very well. Thanks for that.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Now we have a paper from Dr. Sanjit Chakrabarti, who is an assistant professor, senior grade in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Belur Institute of Technology at Andhra Pradesh. No, Andhra Pradesh, yeah. Before that, he taught at Indian Institute of Science Education and Research in Kolkata, Indian Institute of Management Indore, and the Central University of Hyderabad. His philosophical venture was nourished under the guidance of Professor Putnam from 2008 to 16. His work spans the areas of philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, ethics, and artificial intelligence and morality. Sanjit has extensively published around 50 papers in celebrated international journals, edited volumes, and encyclopedias. His work has been reviewed and cited in many international journals by noted scholars. So I give the floor to Sanjit. We will have 20 minutes, Sanjit.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for your kind introduction. So, uh, I'm thankful to the department and the convener of the conference who invited me in this speaker lineup. And because of my prolonged illness, I could not make out for preparing a proper paper. And just for some other reason, even I could not make up for keeping a good, you can say, synopsis or as a kind of PPT presentation. Now, today morning, I realized that. So, in compared to the theme of the conference, if I try to appreciate the opinion of Wittgenstein, conception of the showability and sayability, then let me make a try for sayability instead of the showability. So, yeah, the topic of my presentation focus on language, truth, and reality. What do we really know? Okay, and uh, my deep apologize. I am apologize for the people who are expecting something from Jain philosophy because I'm not expert on this area. So I especially work on the analytic philosophy. So my perspective relies on from the analytical trend. And so basically, if I try to keep in mind, people have less understanding what is the thing called language. Well, thanks. So if I try to put the question in the manner, what's the origin of the language? And keeping in mind that people have little bit understanding what's the thing called language, like we have understanding over consciousness. All these things are very spooky and very problematic. Still, we believe that we have the conception of the consciousness. We have conception over life. Similarly, let us try to go one by one. My perspective would be to try to look at language first, then truth, then reality from the perspective of analytic philosophy. Well, so let us start. What is language? I try to look upon the idea from biology, secondly from social linguistic perspectives. So from the biological perspective, along with our genotype, you know, human language is a part of our phenotype because it is influenced by our biological heritage. This is a viewpoint which is much more common in linguistics. Now we are trying to inculcate the same idea in modern philosophy also. So in keeping with the dominant biological perspective in linguistics, the question that I wish to address here, whether we accepted the discussion of philosophy of language can be framed from the perspective of biological concern. So let us try to see the problem from biology, step in biology. So language is not certain kind of supernatural things or cultural things. For biologists, it's a biological contract. You know, perhaps you might be, because I'm trying to say something deliberately for the research scholar, so you might have acknowledged the point that from the biological perspectives, language is genetical based. And they consider it's an innate procedure. Next is a kind of module that result in blind evaluation and is originated from deeply in an involuntary procedure. It's not a voluntary procedure like our other things. So it has a very prolonged evaluation history. You can check the literature of John Piaget, the principle of genetic epistemology, or Wilson sociobiology. So I try to
inculcate the idea from three different perspectives. The productivity of language, second, from maturation that relies on the genetics, and third, language faculty. So in a very nutshell, if you try to remember from Socrates' model, where he trigger knowledge procedure, even the procedure of knowing from the representational backgrounds, and he tried to show the model that relies on a deductive method in a latent way. It's not depends on experience. It has some intuitive nature of knowing procedure in a latent way. Now, if we come closer to Noam Chomsky, then he tried to keep emphasis on Cartesian legacy, because Descartes make a dimension between mind and world. So Chomsky much more fascinated by this dimension and gives emphasis on human mind by saying that language is not properly regarded as a system of communication. It's a system for expressing thought, something quite different. Language use, I'm quoting from Chomsky's writing, language is use is largely to oneself is a kind of inner speech for adult. It's a kind of inner speech for adult and monologue for the children. Now, the concept of maturation that relies on genetics. For Chomsky, language is not a sort of reinforcement that is tied to experience and uses. Language is possible because of the innate universal grammar. That has two perspectives. One is the generative perspective of the universal grammar, and second one is the transformative rules that always depends on a creative sense of language use. And the third point that I have to inculcate here is language faculty. Nothing stops us from saying that human phenotype consists of an organ that capable to unbound productivity. It's like you have very limited access of the word, but you can construct unlimited sentences. That's called the productivity of the language. It's just because of some language faculty. Some philosopher consider that this faculty is like some organic part of the brain. I have a little bit doubt about that. So like breathing, reproduction, they consider semantic properties are biological properties. Semantic properties, not the syntax. They consider deliberately that syntax are biological properties. Now they try to include some more things, like they consider semantic properties are the a kind of, you can say, biological property. And they also consider that, they take a turn from syntax to semantics and putting meaning and truth also together in the domain. So my quest here to check, can we put meaning theory, language, in connection to syntax to check whether this theory work out in the framework of Davidson, Dummett, Quine. We are so lucky, Professor Bilgami was there, he is a student of Davidson, and Professor Pradhan is there, direct student of Dummett, and so many Quinean followers are here. So it's my quest. Because of my prolonged illness, I could not make out for doing some substantive work on this particular area, but I have a hope and I have a dream. And I believe, like my mentor Hilary Putnam, that you could have a good dream in philosophy, but you should remember that that's a kind of dream that should not match up with the reality. So I could have a dream. So let me just focus on Davidsonian perspective of biological endeavor of language. So, when Davidson tried to focus on language and mental state, he tried to define it from an interconnected perspective of the mental other state. So this interconnection could be possible due to some holistic perspectives. So now we can place the same thing from a anatomy manner. Like it's a kind of hypothetical example. Like I can say, our development of the hands possible because of the development of the feet. Okay. And same thing could be possible from the linguistic background, because we can claim that the primitive language developed from the predicative calculus that speaking by the ancestors. So this sort of anatomy and analysis of language faculty could be possible in the domain of Davidson. Now, what would be for the Dummett? Attributing meaning is actually attributing of having verification condition. That is a core principle of Dummettian philosophy, where Hilary Putnam takes a different U-turn. For Putnam, the condition of meaning depends on truth rather than the verification theory. That is the core part of internal realism. So from the biological perspective, if you try to emphasize on verification condition, then one had to say it's a better principle because it gives emphasis on phenomenalism, basically from the sense dictum, I mean sense data dictum, where you try to give importance to subject perception rather than the reality. So that is also a perspective of very subjective and biological perspective from the perceiver concern over reality. Now, what would be the position of Quine? In a very nutshell, Quine takes a different stance because his opinion is like that neither truth condition nor verification condition work out in the domain of meaning. So the supposed meaning-giving quality is a remnant of antiquity, like you can say antiquated mythology. Just like for his particular term, as far as I remember, he says it's a kind of poorly steered entelachy, E-N-T-E-L-E-C-H-Y, entelachy, if I pronounce well. So this philosophical input on this entelachy, where you have a possibility to talk about meaning theory, but this possibility cannot go closer to the reality. It's potentiality. You cannot talk about something very substantive over meaning. Yeah. So these are the biological perspectives where we can look at language. And in a very nutshell, I can say we are trying to put this same biological perspective in meaning theory also and truth condition. Like the question, whether theories of meaning also pass through the biological theories or truth condition have a biological purpose as a result of the evolutionary process that occurred not too long ago, developed in each person's brain. So they consider the meaning theory as well as the truth condition both develop in our brain. It's a brain procedure. So it's a kind of biological development. It's not like some socio-linguistic development that inculcated later by some externalist, Hilary Putnam, Tyler Burst, Donald Davidson, Akhil Bilgami also. So in a basic sense, truth have, so many common theories we already taught in universities like correspondence theory of truth, coherence theory. So for me, correspondence theory of truth is much more closer from the perspective of metaphysics, which it corresponds to the reality. Whereas coherence theory of truth, it is a kind of way to epistemology. Why? Because here we cohere between different set of interconnected beliefs. So these are the epistemic perspective. When you are looking from the interconnected beliefs, that's much more epistemic perspective. When you are looking on giving emphasis on the corresponded to the reality, it's objective perspectives. And these things are much more closer with very well-known debate like realism and anti-realism. So many faculties are there who already give some highlighter on this particular area in the seminar. I missed it yesterday. So what is my rejoinder here? My rejoinder is give importance to two different questions. First, objects that we perceive do not appear out of nowhere at all. Where objects are presented through conceptual schemata, a constructive rejoinder that allows for a significant resilience lineage, a form of materialization that cannot set aside imputational order. Roughly, what we find out is not an intensification of monotonous interaction independent objectivity. It's a kind of interlock between your conceptual schemata, it means whatever is present in front of your conceptual scheme, and second is a kind of lineage, or you can say is a kind of tie-up with your conceptual schemata with the reality that you are looking at. So I'll be happy to conclude my session by saying that any ontological properties that a subject or knower conceives and interprets are entangled in an appropriate epistemic disposition. And this is an apparent response to the imbalance between epistemology and metaphysics that drives contraminted conceptual capacity and you can say conceptual objectivity. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I open the floor for comments and question. If there is any, please. Yeah, please.
Hello. Sir, when you asserted the fact that language is biological and not cultural,
I never said not cultural
okay,
because, okay,
okay.
these are two different dimensions. My time never permit me
So,
to say. Okay, continue.
so when Chomsky talks about the innate language argument,
Hmm.
he establishes two principles. One of the language acquisition device,
Hmm.
and the second of innate structure of sentences. But when he establishes the language acquisition device argument, he says that such language acquisition device gets stimulated by external factors.
True.
So in a way, is it not in furtherance of Skinner's argument if this language acquisition device is getting stimulated by external factors, what is innate about it then?
So, Isa, you picked up a very good point that I appreciate. But let me tell you that what makes the difference between B.F. Skinner and Noam Chomsky. For Skinner, point of view, any kind of stimulation that derives from your biological perspectives. So it's absolutely some organic biological perspective. But for Chomsky, I mean, the stipulation comes from your interest in mind. So that makes a great difference between Chomskyan hypothesis on innate language and B.F. Skinner approach on this particular behaviorism. Thank you. Yeah, please, sir.
Uh,
And the inactive cognitive processes is neither innate nor they are externally caused, nor they are even biologically evolved, because evidentially we can't say that inactive cognition is biological or the organism. Now, as far as Chomsky is concerned, Chomsky is totally ignoring this inactive embodied OV type of biological cognition. That is at the root of that.
As per my understanding goes on Chomsky, in his, I mean, it's 1 decade back, I mean, his latest book on New Horizon in the Study of Language and Mind, 2000, yes, it published in the year 2000. So 20 years back, near about, he tried to give emphasis on the idea of language procedure, bringing the idea of mental image. And as per my understanding goes, this idea of mental image, uh, Hilary Putnam and Sanford Goldberg, they're working together in a conference. Because for him, uh, in our first belief system, like they call first belief and second order belief, first order belief, second order belief. In our first order belief system, you could have some mental image that you could not express in your language because language could not have the capacity to express in word when you have the mental images. And he picked up a particular example, like how to avoid traffic jam. Okay, perhaps you can drive your car and you try to avoid the traffic jam. And if I ask you, so how did you avoid the traffic jam in Kolkata? Then even now you somehow manage because you could not have the access, mental access and word access to just stimulate the word in a systematic order to express what was in your mental thought. So for him, mental thought in the procedure of image system could not be expressible in language manner. And I appreciate the same thing because we have cognitive, metacognitive procedures in language that you picked up.
In other words, he will be a mental process, independent of the
Language process. For him, I mean,
biological.
true. For him, thought precedes language, not language precedes thought.
Yeah, please, you want to say something?
Hello. Uh,
Yeah, please.
can you please elaborate how the perception is deal with object to know through the process of biological perspective?
You are asking about the perception of the object.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have multifaceted dimension about the perception of the object because you can have a chance to look at from basically from Jainism. They have multifaceted dimension over understanding the perspective of the truth from different perspective of the knowledge system, and they equally give importance to each and every perspective of the knowledge system. But in our analytical philosophy, you have to first check what sort of philosophical dimension and philosophical school you supposed to bring in your theory of meaning and theory of references. For me, who are working on causal theory of reference, for them, I mean, the word and the world, they have a direct referential accesses. But if you try to work on from representational theory, like Franz Jackson, so that time, no, there is no direct relation between word and world. The relation comes through or via a medium that is called belief procedure. And it brings mental representation there instead of any causal efficacy between word and world.
Just a very quick question. How do you sort of see the, Davidson, Dummett, Putnam, Quine, Chomsky, they have proposed various ways in which we can think of language and the question of meaning associated with language. I think the philosophers were more concerned with the question of meaning that was very prominent with all Davidson, Dummett, Putnam, Quine. How do you sort of bring them together to understand a notion of language which would be sort of, overarching, as it were?
Yeah, I know. I got your point, madam. So the point, yeah. So what is my endeavor here? I try to check whether we can place Davidsonian theory of meaning, Dummetian theory, and I never bring Putnam here, and Quinean theory of meaning from the perspective of the biology. If I succeed, then I will be try to follow, the lineage of the analytic philosophy. If I fail, then I will be like the Jainist philosophy by saying that we could have different opinion. So perhaps you're not supposed to accept my opinion, but it's my opinion. But for me, as per my previous reading on their overall understanding on theory of meaning, I check it that we somehow could place Davidsonian theory. Even Wittgenstein also, because in PI, Wittgenstein talks about mental images. So when you're talking about some mental image, even in chapters also, then you could not nullify the conception that it has no connection with our biological sense. And for Fine, I think his approach is like biological eliminist, because he tried to just eliminate the idea of meaning by saying that meaning is second-grade notion, because he gives much more emphasis on scientific analysis of meaning theory. So for him, meaning is nothing like a second-grade notion. So he never gives emphasis on meaning by saying that meaning is something that is much more important in the school of Davidson or Dummett or Hilary Putnam also. So I emphasize the idea like he's much more closer to Pavlov, or you can say also to B.F. Skinner, like my friend picked up. So because they consider meaning has no direct function in philosophy of language. It could have some access in our psychology. It could have some access in our you can say biology or physiology. It's a part of our brain function. So you could not bring meaning in the order Hilary Putnam, Dummett, and some other analytic philosopher try to focused on. So that's my try. I'm not sure about that. What would be my later position? I'm supposed to work on this area. It looks very interesting to me.
Okay, that's a tentative answer.
Yeah, it's very tentative.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the support, sir.
This is over. Before it is over, I would like to say that this station was a classic example of disjunctivity. We are still left with disjointed ideas. I'm not saying disjointed ideas are bad. Rather, they are more jarring in order to think more.
The last question that came from Professor Munitipa Sen actually tells us what we still need to do. We are still, in the hunt for meaning. Seven blind men. We are visually masked in a sense. And when we are visually masked, we only have a kind of quasi-realism or a kind of quasi-theory at this point of time. And this is best represented in this conference. We are all trying to turn our quasi-theory into full theory, which it never can be turned around in that way. So we are actually pushing against an impossible wall, and that probably is what we learn by when we look at these kind of issues that have been thrown up in the current analytic and post-analytic philosophy. Thank you all for listening to this session.
Thank you so much to all of you. Now, the next session is being started. So first of all, I request Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakravarti sir to please come on the dais. RC Pradhan sir and Professor Prasenjit Vishwas sir, please come on the dais. We know that this session is being presided by Sir Professor RC Pradhan. So, sir is well known for all of us. So there is no need of any introduction. I request Pradhan sir to please conduct the program. Sir, please come.
So, friends, we are starting the next session. We have two very eminent philosophers as the speakers in this session. Professor Nirmalya Narayan Chakravarti and Professor Prasenjit Vishwas. Let me introduce Professor Chakravarti. Already there has been an introduction to Professor Vishwas. Professor Nirmal Narayan Chakravarti is a former Vice Chancellor of Indra Bharati University, Kolkata, where he is presently Professor of Philosophy. His research areas include philosophy of language, classical Indian and Western analytical epistemology, philosophy of religion, environmental ethics. He is the former member secretary of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi. Some of his recent publications include articles like one, Self-Knowledge, The Moral Dilemma, 2023, Realism, Anti-Realism, and Quietism. Has philosophy become dispensable, 2022, on the very idea of the authority of the Vedas, 2020, Tagore and the idea of emancipation, 2020, Methodology in Indian Philosophy, 2018, a cautionary note on Motilal's way of doing Indian philosophy. So with these words, I now request Professor Chakravarti to make his presentation. I think we'll go by the same model, 20 plus 10. Okay, thank you very much.
So good morning, everybody, and let me convey my sincere thanks to Rahul and others who have organized this nice seminar. Let me confess that I don't have the necessary expertise to speak on Jainism, but since I have all sorts of intellectual curiosities over many things. So this invitation gave me the opportunity to explore a bit of K.C. Bhattacharya's understanding of Jaina Anekantavada. I'm sure, especially for my young friends, I'm sure that you are aware that K.C. Bhattacharya is regarded as one of the most creative philosophers of colonial India, who studied and taught at Calcutta University in 1920s and 1930s. And the reason why I want to share my understanding of K.C. Bhatt, because it's just my humble attempt to understand what K.C. Bhattacharya means when he tries to explain some basic ideas of Jaina Anikantavada. And his language is extremely difficult to follow. So I'm not sure whether I am misrepresenting K.C. Bhattacharya or not, but anyway, this is my humble attempt. I think there are two reasons why I really would like my young colleagues to read K.C. Bhattacharya in greater detail. Here is an example, very, very nice example of extracting some new ideas from old theoretical insights, new ideas which probably the original propounder of those ideas never thought of. So this is very important lesson for us in 2023 who are interested in studying classical Indian philosophy. In this interpretation, K.C. Bhattacharya anticipates some issues which later on became very prominent in 20th century analytical philosophy of logic. So these are the two reasons why I thought that maybe we should study K.C. Bhattacharya's interpretation of Jaina Ekantavada, and he does the same thing with Advaita Vedanta as well. I shall skip parts of it because of time constraint. And Bhaskar has already alluded to the issues related to realism, relativism, etc. Just one point, short point at the beginning is K.C. Bhattacharya makes a great attempt to distinguish what he calls traditional realism from Jaina realism, and I think this is one of the very important insights that K.C. Bhattacharya offers. And in his attempt to distinguish traditional realism from Jaina realism, he introduces the idea of indefinite. This is, I think, this has a profound implication for 20th century analytic philosophy of logic as well. Okay, so and in this discussion, in another paper, K.C. Bhattacharya talks about the very nature of logic. Very important, very, very interesting discussion. What is logic? What do we mean by logic? And in that discourse on the very nature of logic, he again introduces the idea of indefinite. Indefinite as a separate, independent, substantive category of logical thought. This is, I think one of the very interesting points that K.C. Bhattacharya, makes. So it is generally held that philosophy aims at one unitary truth. Traditionally, it is held that truth is lying hidden somewhere, and exercising its theoretical tool, philosophy aims at discovering this truth. So truth is somewhere there, and by philosophical methods, we are trying to discover the truth. But denying the claim that truth is multifaceted, that truth has got many manifestations amounts to accepting that philosophy aims at knowing the truth. Richard Rorty, talks about this attempt on the part of philosophers to get at the truth. Okay. If one accepts that truth is many, this very knowledge, namely that truth is many, is one unitary knowledge, one truth. The knowledge of many truths is manifest in one single knowledge, that there are many truths. This is important because K.C. Bhattacharya harps on this distinction. One could ask, if the knowledge that truth is many, multifaceted, and the individual knowledge episodes about the many facets of truth are produced at the same time, so there are two levels of knowledge working. One is the base cognitions. This is my expression. This is not K.C. Bhattacharya's terminology. So one is the base cognitions. P is truth, Q is truth, R is truth, etc., etc. And we all, whenever we talk about Jainism, we all think of that example that has been mentioned by earlier speakers also, that those 5 blind men describing the elephant. So there are base cognitions, and there is also this knowledge that these are all base cognitions of the truth, of the elephant. So now K.C. Bhattacharya is raising this question. If the knowledge that truth is many and the individual knowledge episodes about the many facets of truth are produced at the same time, this certainly demands an explanation. With the knowledge of many individual truths, like P is true, Q is true, R is true, etc., there appears another knowledge that all these are individual truths. So it's a meta-epistemic claim, so to say. Simultaneous generation of two pieces of knowledge implies that there is a relation between the two. In the present context, one has to claim that multiple knowledge episodes, P is true, Q is true, etc., and the knowledge that these are all multiple possibilities, which is a kind of meta-knowledge, appear simultaneously. If realism implies that things around us and they having the properties that they have are independent of our knowledge, then realism would claim that the individual cognitions, like X is flat, X is round, etc., are all determinate and true. Taking the famous example of the 5 blind persons describing an elephant, all the individual cognitions are complete. So X is flat, this is one cognition, X is round, this is another cognition, etc. But the Jain philosophers would not accept that these individual cognitions are determinate. This is K.C. Bhattacharya's understanding. Jain philosophers talk about a unity among these individual truths. This is where K.C. Bhattacharya introduces the idea of indefinite. For traditional realism, the discrete cognitions are determinate in themselves and so independent of each other. Jain philosophers talk about bringing in a unity among these determinate truths. This is where Jain view differs from traditional realism according to K.C. Bhattacharya. And this difference could be accounted for by the idea of the indefinite according to K.C. Bhattacharya. K.C. Bhattacharya notes that the relation among the discrete individual cognitions and the relation between these individual cognitions and the meta-knowledge, that all these individual cognitions are discrete ones, are not of the same kind. So we are talking about two levels of knowledge, and we are also talking about two levels of relation. One is the individual discrete base cognitions, X is flat, X is round, etc. There is a relation between these individual base cognitions. But then we are making another claim. We are making the claim that all these base cognitions are different facets. So there is a meta level claim. So there's a relation between the individual base cognitions, and also there's a relation between the individual base cognitions and the meta epistemic claim. The relation that obtains among the base level cognitions and the relation that obtains among the base level cognitions and the complex knowledge quantifying over all the individual cognitions are of different kinds. While the base elements could be understood in respect to each other, the metacognition containing all the base cognitions could be understood in itself. The base cognitions are distinct from each other. X is flat, distinct from X is round, etc. But the complex, being a collection of the base cognitions, could be understood as distinct in itself. Now, alternation comes in two stages then. One, the discrete individual cognitions like X is flat, X is round, etc. are alternate. But the knowledge that all these individual cognitions are present together, and this is the conclusion of Anikantavada, is an absolute knowledge. If one has to accept the simultaneous presence of these alternates and the absolute knowledge, the main claim of Anikantavada, then one could detect the presence of alternation between the individual cognitions and the absolute knowledge. And this is where traditional realism differs from Jaina realism according to KCB. Traditional realism exhausts itself in the individual determinate cognitions. The story ends there. If one tries to understand Jaina Anikantavada in terms of the idea of alternation, then one could see that Jaina theory rests on the alternation of ekanta and ekanta. Anekantavada in this way is the home of both the individual discrete base cognitions and the metacognition having all the base cognitions as its content. Cognitive exclusivity is, as defended by traditional realism, is absent in Jaina Anekantavada. I think this is how K.C. Bhattacharya distinguishes traditional realism from Jaina realism. If one wants to distinguish the base cognitions, which are individual determinate cognitions, they are to be understood as distinct from other base cognitions. So X is flat as distinct from another base cognition, X is round. E is flat is to be understood as distinct from E is round. Thus, the base epistemic elements are to be understood as distinct from others. If realism is understood as knowledge independence, then as the base cognitions are real, so is the meta-knowledge where all the base cognitions are simultaneously present, because these are all ekantas. This is the claim, right? The presence of this simultaneity between the individual discrete base cognitions, X is round, X is flat, etc., and the claim, the meta epistemic claim that all these are, ekantas of the truth. So the presence of this simultaneity is also real in the sense of being independent of our epistemic apparatus. So if we understand Jaina Anekantavada both in terms of distinct base cognitions and the simultaneous knowledge of all these individual base cognitions, then we see that in the case of simultaneous knowledge, as there is a distinction from each other, similarly there is a distinction from each other. The base cognitions involve distinction from each other, and the meta-knowledge, where all these base cognitions are simultaneously present, involves distinction from each other. The simultaneous presence of all these base cognitions is what implies the distinction from distinction from each other. Generally, this distinction from each other is understood as identity. Identity is of crucial importance to the idealist. Primarily, K.C. Bhattacharya has Hegel in his mind when he was talking about this. Distinction gets primacy for the realist. For the idealist, metaphysics culminates in the ultimate identity. For him, distinction is an incomplete manifestation of identity. This, of course, is to be acknowledged that knowledge of distinction is not a negative one like the illusory knowledge. So, for K.C. Bhattacharya, this negation, this distinction is a substantive category. On KCB's interpretation of Anekantavada, the distinction that one observes in the simultaneous presence of the base cognitions is available under one unified knowledge. Identity is the simultaneity of the base distinct cognitions. For the idealist, identity is the mutual implication of distinctness. Synthesis is distinction. Synthesis of distinctness is identity. For the realist, on the other hand, distinctness is primary. But if we think of Samavaya relation in Nyaya, when cowness resides in an individual cow, the relation between a cow and its cowness could be understood as identity in difference. They are distinct, at least as content of thought, but that then one resides in the other and one cannot be thought of without the other. They are identical, distinct. This is K.C. Bhattacharya's expression, identical hyphen distinct. So when one thinks of a definite object, one cannot but think of the duality of essence and specificity. So he is always, harping on this duality. KCB understands simultaneity in terms of duality. If objects get floated in knowledge resting on duality, and if the metaphysical home of simultaneity is duality, then we have to accept that knowledge oscillates in between the two poles of specificity of the object and distinctness from specificity. This dual polarization is called indefinite by KCB. When one has the knowledge of the base distinct cognitions, one knows them as distinct from each other. So X is flat, distinct from X is round, etc. And when one has the knowledge of these distinct base cognitions simultaneously, Anekantavada claims that all the base cognitions are partially true, then one knows the base cognitions as distinct from simultaneous cognition. This is epistemic indefiniteness. The couple of the definite indefinite gets floated in knowledge. K.C. Bhattacharya calls this definite indefinite relation. In other words, plurality cannot be rejected. Also, the simultaneous knowledge of plurality cannot be rejected either. Distinctness is very much present in plurality, but there remain non-distinctness and unity in the simultaneous knowledge of plurality. This, according to K.C. Bhattacharya, the idea of indefinite as it emerges from Jaina Anekantavada. Now, I'm skipping parts of it because of time constraint. So if the idea of indefinite is so important as it emerges from K.C. Bhattacharya's reinterpretation of Jaina Anekantavada, what shape would logic take if we incorporate the idea of indefinite in logic? KCB's attempt to excavate the idea of indefinite in the Jaina Anekantavada tosses the question whether the idea of indefinite could seriously be considered as an ingredient in logical thought. And if so, what ramifications it would have for logic in general. KCB talks about three possible ways of understanding indefinite. One, indefinite as something extra logical, associated with one's psychological history. In this sense, any science or logic is required to get rid of such accompaniments. Two, indefinite as a precursory presumption, the interplay of the uncertain and the certain, landing us in the realm of the definite. Indefinite in this view is definite in waiting. I think he was talking about Hegel here, Hegelian dialectic. Three, in dialectic, indefinite has got a more constructive role. It is the function of truth in the sense that by overcoming indefinite, one could move to a greater truth, which in its turn is not a static one. Indefinite is thus, to quote KCV, a constructive factor in definite truth. The important question that we confront here is whether logic could accommodate the idea of absolute indefinite as different from the indefinite that is constitutive of the definite. In other words, could we talk of logic being the home of a distinct value called indefinite? Distinct from definite, where indefinite is not a mere appendage to definite, but an independent category that logical truths partake in. A thoroughgoing, robust skepticism leaves room for such a question. Whether universal skepticism is a cogent view or not is a question that lies beyond logic. Now comes, what does KCB mean by logic? What is logic according to KCB? What is the function of logic according to KCB? KCB, logic as a study of forms of thoughts cannot be a party to metaphysical disputes. This is what KCB, this is how KCB talks about logic. So logic cannot be a party to the metaphysical disputes. Logic deals with abstract principles of thought. It articulates the form of thought. This thought could be about human mind, psychology, could be about physical phenomena, science, could be about general features of reality, metaphysics. When we talk of logic being formal, we mean it formulates the principles of thought that might be directed to different areas of experience. So logic also deals with the forms of doubt, and in this sense, logic is neutral to commitment in metaphysics. Logic is not concerned with any particular department of thought, and so it is universal. I quote KCV, the principle of logic should be absolutely abstract. Some versions of epistemology claim to rest itself on some self-evident foundational knowledge claims, and this claim has equally been subject to skepticism. Logic, as KCB understands it, does not have the right to take a side in this debate. Logic as an abstract science can only provide the scaffolding of thoughts that could move either way. Neither defense of foundational certain knowledge nor refutation of such certainty is what concerns logic, according to KCB. And here KCB introduces the dualism of definite indefinite as involved in the very structure of logic. I quote, the most abstract and comprehensive dualism that can be conceived is that between the definite and the indefinite. Even to deny this dualism, definite and indefinite, one leads one to get involved in the dualism itself. One could think of moving beyond this dualism in a dialectic structure, but this moving beyond would not necessarily yield a thought form. Logic, as KCB interprets it, does not yield any definite law of thought. In a dialectic, There is always an emphasis on arriving at a positive truth. But logic in its present form, as KCV understands it, does not eschew any such allegiance to finality. If one would like to formulate this dualism in terms of a principle, the principle could be formulated rather paradoxically, and this is again KCV's expression: indefinite is not and is indefinite at once. What KCV means is that since this is a fundamental dualism, even the line between definite and indefinite is itself indefinite. Both identity and difference between opposed terms are equally taken care of, and so the demarcation between definite and indefinite is a, to quote KCV, vanishing quantity. The fundamental principles of logic have been formulated in three ways. I'm not getting into these details. When KCV talks about logic in terms of the dualism of definite and indefinite, and this is how he distinguishes traditional realism from Jaina realism. When KCV talks about logic in terms of dualism of definite and indefinite, definite and indefinite, right? The expression. What does the and mean here? The conjunction. The and here is a form of, to quote KCV, a form of illogicality or the despair of knowledge. I really like this expression, despair of knowledge. Our urge, but always remain dissatisfied. This implies that we have to reformulate the demand of logic, so much so, again KCV, I mean, this is a profound remark. Contradiction is just as conceivable as otherwise. KCV, while comparing his view with those of Kant and Spencer, holds that indefinite cannot be pushed aside into the realm of unknowable reality. This is one of his main criticisms of Kant. For KCV, indefinite is a third category, side by side with position and negation, the content of positive logic itself. One is reminded here of the claim of the intuitionistic logic, where a third value other than true false is recognized. While the tenability of the principle of bivalence is doubted in intuitionistic logic, realism as founded on the principle of bivalence is also subject to skepticism. But if, as KCV has shown, Jaina Anekantavada advocates a variety of realism that is different from the traditional realism by accommodating the idea of the indefinite, then perhaps realism simpliciter is not opposed to intuitionism. This, I think this is something that one could pose to Dummett. Jaina realism could be seen as more Catholic to intuitionism because of the idea of indefinite that it entertains, as per KCV. The details along this line of thought are worth exploring. I just, conclude with two brief remarks in which, further research along this line could be carried on. One is, this idea of a third value, which KCV calls indefinite. Michael Dummett, in one of his early 70s papers called Truth, explored this idea and argues that there are, important statements in our language which really cannot be, accommodated within the two-valued logical system. He uses the word indefinite. He uses the word indeterminate. So, it would be an interesting study to explore Dummett's idea of indeterminate as a value, as a value of certain set of statements, and KCV's idea of the indefinite and their role in logic. Another interesting point of line one could pursue here is again, a lot of people, and Dummett being the most prominent advocate of this view, is that realism is at bottom uh, a defense of a particular theory of meaning. This is he has tried to argue for this in many of his papers, and the entire central well, what's the name of the book? The William James lecture. By the logical basis of metaphysics, the entire book is devoted in defense of this. So if realism as a metaphysical theory is at bottom an account of a theory of meaning, then one could explore the Jaina realism as distinct from traditional realism, the way K.C. Bhattacharya explores it, understands it. What could be the Jaina account of meaning, the Jaina theory of meaning that would serve the basis of this specific variety of Jaina realism as K.C. Bhattacharya understands. Thank you very much.
Professor Chakravarti, thank you very much for this very structured talk on KCV's interpretation of Jaina logic. The very idea of indefinite, which he has so eloquently elaborated, is the new concept that we have to really understand. And with that, the idea of the particular truths, how they get summated into or get into the higher level of the unified truth. That is the most important feature of the Jaina way of talking about Anikantavada. Though there are different particular truths, base truths, but at the highest level also they get simultaneously true in some form of absolute knowledge or Kevala Jnana. So I think some of these very important concepts Professor Chakravarti has introduced, and he has also indicated how Jaina logic could provide new insights to understand the contemporary analytic thinkers like Michael Dummett. So with this, I invite questions. Many will start this one, but I will give preference first to those who have not raised questions yet. So I will go. We have only 10 minutes or maximum 15 minutes. It depends on Rahul. See, Professor Rahul, please, first.
Hello. Yeah. So thank you, sir, for your really wonderful presentation. I was just wondering that this idea of indeterminate that you presented, indefinite and the indeterminate as well. So this example of the Jaina's example of elephant, where the 5 different blind men are, having a partial reality. If we really look at it perspectival knowledge, then I think the only reality which is available to these people is epistemically, you can say, perspectival reality only, or indeterminate itself will become determinate, rather than saying that all these different perspectival understanding will converge into a very determinate and metaphysical truth. Because then one has to rise above his or her own perspective to see that all these different perspectives are converging into this. So then I think it is presupposing a certain kinds of metaphysical truth, right, which is in a way becoming binding upon these perspectivals. Then this perspectival knowledge is losing its significance. So I think the only knowledge that we can have is what epistemically available within our own perspectives, and that is how the reality will always remain plural in that sense, will not be seen as one sort of determinate reality. So how would you like to respond to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your brilliant three small queries. One was, I was wondering, when you talk about distinction from distinction, within the Jain perspective, is it not more appropriate to take the Buddhist Tadbhin as the distinction from distinction rather than the Jain position? The second was that, the question of Aristotle's being and becoming was an interesting way of making distinction and then still retaining the theory. And the third and last that I just wanted you to, as you presented a project for future, in case of Dummett, he's saying that only some of the propositions will have the nature of indeterminate, but in case of the Jains, as you were to see, it would be for all. And that, I think, is an extremely important thing to remember. So how would you respond?
Hello. Just one clarification, sir. Two clarifications. This indefinite category of indefinite is immanent or transcendent? I mean, that it is inside the definite or it falls outside definite? It is like relativism or meta-relativism kind of a thing. And second thing is that thinking about the genesis of the definite, as the Tattva Sutra reveals, that it is language that makes possible the definite to exist from the ground of indefinite. I would like to know whether K.C. Bhattacharya has spoken anything about that kind of thing. Thank you. This like the definite is possible for language from the indefinite, following K.C. Bhatta's term. As I understood my reading of Tattva Sutra, whether K.C. Bhatta has said anything about, yes.
Yeah, actually, I am basically citing the most important authority on K.C. Bhattacharya, which is George Birch. I think in order to understand the idea of indefinite without the agenda behind it is, I think, would be injustice to K.C. Bhattacharya. He says logic alone cannot establish the absolute as the indefinite. This is established by revelation, but logic can make it intelligible. So I just want to know that if we quote Wittgenstein in this regard, whereof one cannot speak, one must remain the silent. And in the, if bring that debate into this realm, don't you think that K.C. Bhattacharya is somehow making some sort of mystic kind of thing? So ultimately the idea of putting revelation into the realm of logic and understanding the idea of indefinite without absolute, like such kind of confusion that comes into the philosophical debate, it need to be clarified. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have a very small, maybe naive question. That you made a distinction between basic cognition and the knowledge. Then I want to ask you that how will you pursue this contradictory knowledge, or when the in terms of free will and determinism, when possibility of one cannot be ascertain the possibility of next. So how will you synthesize in the knowledge this example? Thank you.
Was just curious. I'm just curious to know about the simultaneity principle that you mentioned. Also, does it resonate in the QM, the quantum mechanic area, where the quanta is both is particle as well as wave. The third thing is that the scientists are saying it is wavical. So will that bring a kind of a problem, because the simultaneity principle has problem in science. So if you try to explain that in the context of Bhattacharya, would you like to explore that? And it's not just this. Would you like to? Thank you.
Actually, thank you so much, sir, for your good presentation. So I have query about the indefinite notion of reality when you talked about the KCB's model of despair of knowledge. Whether there is any fear of end of knowledge, end of philosophy. In that respect, we are searching in a Heideggerian, yes, Heideggerian perspectives. Yes.
Since I probably don't have satisfactory, responses to all of them. Um, Let me just try. I mean, Rahul, the way I understand KCB's treatment of uh, Jaina Anikantavada, where he introduces this idea of indefinite in a big way. I think he is very cautious to distinguish what he calls traditional realism from Jaina realism. And one of the ways of giving an account of that distinction is to talk about knowledge at two levels. This is where I use this expression, base level cognitions. X is flat, X is round, etc., etc. And I think what KCB wants to suggest that traditional realism ends there. All these individual discrete knowledges, okay, are real in whatever sense the realist talks about. But then I think the additional contribution of Anekantavada lies in the fact that they are also making a generalized claim that all these individual discrete cognitions are ekantas. This is another big claim. This is actually, the basic claim of Anekantavada. Now, if you want to explain the simultaneity of the base level cognitions and this meta level cognition, then perhaps one could make sense of the distinct claim of Jaina realism different from the traditional realism. I mean, this is how I try to understand KCB. Now, distinctness from distinctness, I mean, these are all very difficult expressions, but this is how I try to understand. When you understand the discrete cognitions, X is flat, X is round. Well, X is flat as distinct from another base level cognition, X is round. X is round as distinct from another base level cognitions, and so on. But then, how would you account for the simultaneous meta level knowledge that all these individual cognitions are, ekanta jnana? And that is where I think KCB uses this expression, distinctness from distinctness. Okay, this is a bit confusing, but I think one could unpack this idea this way. I think one of the major insights, as far as my understanding goes, that KCB offers us is this idea of indefinite is not only what should you say, not only an epiphenomenon like the Hegelian dialectic, insofar as KCB's understanding is concerned. So it has got more flesh and blood into it. And he proposes at least that logic, the way he understands it as a study of form of thought, should take into account this substantive idea of indefinite. This indefinite is not definite in waiting. This will remain indefinite. And this despair for knowledge, that's KCB's expression. Would force us to reformulate, to re-articulate content of logic itself. So this is what I find very exciting, because he is writing in 1920s and 1930s about these things, and people are now discussing, in the last 20-30 years, people are discussing all these issues. Is indefinite immanent or transcendent? I mean, I don't know whether this is the right question to ask KCB, but KCB's perhaps, I mean, if I want to hold a brief on behalf of KCB, I would suggest that it is it's a positive category of the abstract forms of thought which logic tries to articulate. Okay. Well, I don't know about whether this might lead to some kind of mysticism or not. At least in the intuitionistic philosophy of mathematics, they talk about mathematical statements. That we have not been able to construct a proof of. But if that is mysticism, well, let that be mysticism. Mysticism is not necessarily a philosophical folly, So anyway, I really don't have the the expertise to talk about quantum mechanics here. I don't know how one could introduce this idea of indefinite, but certainly that is something one could explore, because I don't want to talk about that. End of philosophy, no. Because in the concept of philosophy, I think, which is a prescribed text in many Indian universities, he talks about philosophy as a spiritual exercise. Remember that, but spiritual not in the sense of of being religious in some sense. He distinguishes philosophy from science in this way. Okay, so certainly not end of philosophy, but this desire, this urge to move and move and move. Okay, and to be able to, I think this is important, to be able to account for thousands of alternatives. Kalidas Bhattacharya uses an expression, his son, I mean, Sahasra Shirsha. So it has thousands of faces. So that is something I think important take home for me, insofar as KCV's idea of indefinite is concerned.
Good afternoon to everyone. Our respected chair, Professor Pradhan, my fellow panelist, Professor Chakrabarti, and other co-panelists and co-speakers, and very distinguished audience. It gives me an immense pleasure here to really talk about something like Anekantabada. And Anekantabada is not just a Jaina doctrine, but Anekantabada, in a broad generic sense, is a pluralism about truths. And when we talk about pluralism, we are talking about being plural on pluralism itself. So you not only have a many-sided version of reality, but you also have a many-sided version of the many-sided reality, which makes both one-sidedness and non-one-sidedness as a kind of impossibility. So I sum up Anikantabhada by saying that non-one-sidedness or one-sidedness are both impossibilities within the framework of epistemology. Now, when I say within the framework of epistemology, what is that framework of epistemology? Very, very briefly, I want to draw your attention to two concepts which are absolutely necessary to understand pluralism about pluralism. One concept is about factivity of the knowledge claims. That knowledge claims are claims in the making, claims in the process of making a claim or doing a claim of knowledge. It's not really a claim of knowledge without that doing part of knowledge. And that is what is factivity. We cannot go non-factive in terms of saying, like Tarski had said in his deflationary account, P is true if and only if P. Snow is white if and only if you have an object. Snow is white expressed in the proposition. Now, from the Anikantabhadin idea of reality, we know that, from a certain perspective, it's not just it is and it is not, it is and it is not, but ultimately, something is inexpressible. That's the bottom line of Anikantabhada. So what is inexpressible in a deflationary account of truth, which is just an epistemic account, without the account of doing in it, for which it is called deflationary, is a kind of a deficit version of truth. Now, most of the so-called objectivist pluralist accounts bank on a deficit version of truth. A version of truth where P is in contradiction with not P, where P is different from Q, and then if you take P is in contradiction with not P and different from Q, then you have a singular identity of P. So you have to identify the object. That would deflate your account. I call it a deficit account because the identity of the object does not lie in the object. It is inexpressible, as Anikantabhadins have already realized. I add to that, I take a step further, that inexpressibility leads you to a state of expressing the inexpressibility. So how do you express inexpressibility? Expressing inexpressibility is something that takes us beyond Chomskyan kind of linguistics. It takes us to a kind of an enactive, once again I'm saying, by doing we know the truth, a kind of an enactive, embodied, enworded matrix of truth, which is not dependent on the object, at all, because the identity of the object cannot be precise, it is inexpressible. Beforehand, I'm saying this. Therefore, you cannot have a default position of objectivity anymore, because any default position on objectivity is going to be non-truth apt. It's also going to be a certain kind of imprisonment within an already presumed notion of the world. And therefore, you must move from an already presumed notion of the world to a presuppositionless, non-presumable, non-expressible notion of world, which you are trying to express now in your many-sided version of reality. Now, this takes us to something very sophisticated, which is happening just now. We call it jetectic turn in epistemology. And jetectic turn in epistemology is something like what you inquire for after you have made a claim of knowledge. And what is that claim of knowledge that you are trying to make? You are trying to make a claim of knowledge, saying that, if it is true, then it is knowable. Now reverse it. If it is not true, then does it become unknowable? And if it is even unknowable, can't we talk about unknown objects or even unknown other kinds of entities, trans objects, which are not really objects? So we are not able to settle between knowledge and truth. We are not able to settle between unknown and unknowable. And we are not also able to settle between the unknowable known and the unknowable unknown. Now, when COVID virus was leading the entire situation, what was this COVID virus? The COVID virus was not a knowable unknown, but it was an unknowable unknown that was partially known in terms of an Onekantavadi interpretation. Some were talking about 29 proteins. Others were talking about messenger RNA of 3 different kinds. And some were talking about 5 different kinds of codons. Now, 5 different kinds of codons and messenger RNA of 3 different kinds and 29 spike proteins, how could they all come in a so-called double helix structure of COVID-19 virus? That we couldn't yet resolve. There is a definite unknowable unknown that is being expressed by our encoding of the COVID-19 virus, which we are collecting from a variety of samples and assembling them. And while we assemble them, all assemblies are showing a kind of a variation, and this variation is not a kind of a multivariate variation that you can bring it under a statistical regression model. You are going in a Bayesian way where your knowledge of a certain sequence of COVID-19 virus depends on what other people do not know of that COVID-19 sequence. And you have multiple such unknown versions of COVID-19 viruses, based on which you are producing a little area of knowing of the COVID-19 sequence. I'm just giving you a COVID-19 sequence to explain to you what is happening in knowledge of science, even knowledge of mathematics. Somebody brought in. What is happening in mathematics is that mathematics is trying to progress in a teleparallel space. The spaces are highly holographic. You do not have definite contours of this space or topology. It's a kind of a non-topological projected holographic space of a variety of dimensions. If we take 3 dimensions, one kind of mathematics. If I take 3 dimensions here and 5 dimensions in Mars, we have a different kind of a comparatist framework in mathematics. Let's call it a Bayesian framework. And this is how quantum Bayesianism builds on the notion of unknown unknowable. Now this is what is happening in the field of knowledge. So therefore, how do we account for this as philosophers? Well, one way of talking about is a notion of mediated truth. We mediate between several unknowns, and we conveniently, based on our protocols of knowledge, based on what kind of instruments I have. If I have 2 eyes and 2 hands, I have one kind of protocol. If I have 2 eyes and 5 different neurons connected with some visual motor mechanism, then I have another kind of framework. I have a human framework, I have a post-human framework, I have a transhuman framework. And if I'm able to scale through the scales of time, and I'm able to place myself 1 billion year distant in a light year, mathematically, I'll have a different kind of framework. Let's call them teleparallel universes. And these teleparallel universes are communicating to each other at this moment by using something like a gravity, which is supposed to be a fundamental force of nature. And this fundamental force of nature also, as Professor Chakraborty has already said, it's a kind of an indefinite. It's not an indefinite definite. It's not a definite. It's an indefinite, 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 where you do not see any definiteness about it. Now, this is what we are confronting now in science as well as in philosophy. Therefore, we need to mediate this situation. Now, how do we mediate this situation? One of the answers is that we talk about truth without the truth makers. We can talk about a number of truths where we won't have to bother about a fixed relationship between object and properties. Indeed, K.C. Bhattacharya was asking a question about ontological status of relations. What is the ontological status of this relation between this object and this property? Is there a kind of a fixed ontology that is possible of a relation? Well, an ontology of objects, forces, natural kind entities, all that is possible by establishing certain model laws, certain causal laws. But what is the ontology of a relation? Can the relation exist without the relator? Well, one answer is coming from Jaina Buddha metaphysics, that relations can exist without the relator. Relations do not pervade the relator. Relations are beyond the relationality. So relations that are beyond relationality, which in logic Professor Ramsey expounded the idea of vagueness. In terms of vagueness, relations beyond relationality in Ramsey algebra, we can get that. So there's a certain amount of vagueness that is induced at this point of time, and we can't really inductively or deductively settle for certain inferences that are not with ambiguity and vagueness. So ambiguity and vagueness is part of this many-sided interpretation of many-sidedness. Now, somebody may say that ambiguity and vagueness we want to get away with. Now, those who want to get away with ambiguity and those who call it disambiguation, for example, somebody like Chomsky, is not able to answer the question how emotive states are being expressed in language. So Mr. Barsalos, he gives this perceptual symbol processing mechanism. How you perceptually process symbols. You have a simulator in your brain. The simulator creates a person who processes those symbols. The symbols are not coming from anywhere, neither from simulation, not from the so-called person located in your brain. So where are these symbols coming from? Well, one answer is that because you are engaged with the world, it's an enactive mechanism. While Chomsky would be saying that it's a biological mechanism, from evolution you are getting all the symbols. Now, this is something totally inexpressible at this point of time. What are the symbols that you have inherited through a process of evolution? Can we name them? We can't name them anymore. Barsalos have proven it beyond doubt. So therefore, we really do not have a process of disambiguation somewhere in our hand, right hand or left hand. As somebody said, I raised my right hand, I raised my left hand, and you have a commonsensical realism. No, it is not in your hand that you raise your hands anymore. Even if you have raised your hands, it's not in your hands. Even if you have understood that you have raised your hand, that's not in your brain. It's a kind of a simulated symbol processing that is happening in your brain through a number of neural circuits, and the circuits are talking to each other. They are not talking to you, nor they are asking you to talk back to them. Now, this way of patterning a subjectivity by way of recognizing certain patterns of behavior, once again, is a kind of behavioralism. And this behavioralism doesn't lead us to a kind of a full-blown subjectivity. It only can lead us to a limited, contextually dependent ascription of certain properties in an ambiguous manner, in a manner that whatever has been ascribed are not fine-grained. You can try to fine-tune them as we do in artificial intelligence, but fine-tuning certain properties do not make it fine-grained. What is the difference between sleeping and being awake? What is the difference between being mad and being sane? Is there a difference? You cannot disambiguate these meanings. So disambiguation of meanings or disambiguation of precisely cutting context of meaning at this moment is a kind of a semantic exercise that leads to semantic vagueness. And Anekantavada probably provides us a way out of that semantic vagueness. And this is what This is what is expressed by many of these theorists who think that, especially Hume, if you look at Hume again, I know that one person who really energizes everyone. He says that, experience doesn't arise from objects, but objects arise from experience. You see, something very, very distinctively, very contemporary, even at this moment of time, that we experience and then the objects arise. If we don't experience, then the objects do not arise. That question doesn't arise. Now, how do you experience? We experience in the form of inexpressibility more than in the form of expressibility. And this is a poetic state of being. And this poetic state of being has to be now decoded in terms of epistemic theories, of which Anekantavada provides us a major template at this point of time, which needs to be further explored. So I end my talk here. If there are questions, then we can answer those. Thank you. Okay, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. I have simply a small question. It's about how do you philosophize when you claim that I know what I don't know? So here, what it makes that you are claiming that even though you are claiming I don't know. I know what I don't know. So what sort of philosophical position is it? Except skeptical position.
I mean, this is rather simple. You have come across liar paradox and its solutions? Certainly. Liar paradox and its solutions. I'm not going into liar paradox. I'm saying that you can construct as many liar paradoxes as you want to construct. And that is what language allows you to do. That is what your perceptual symbol processing allows you to do. And that is why mathematics is possible. It's no longer the semantics of I know that will decide what you are going to know. This is what I'm saying.
So, so when you're talking about ambiguity and a comparison from Euclidean geometry to non-Euclidean geometry and Menong's geometrical idea, then my question is that we are not, we as linguistic philosophers are not concerned with the ambiguity which restricts the possibility of new knowledge, but we are concerned with the task of definition maker or lexicographer or the predefined definitions which were created, which are getting diluted, for example, in the case of round square. What about the dilution of the role of a definition maker or lexicographer? I am talking about that kind of ambiguity.
Lexicographer is no longer an ideal person to construct knowledge or meaning of the words anymore. Does large language model need a lexicographer to give you meanings? It doesn't require. So what AI is trying to do? AI is connecting all the corpuses where you have fitted your what is correct and what is incorrect. It is combining both the corpuses and producing an idea which is discursively presentable before you. Now, in that, if you want to injunct once again the certain conditions of truth, those truth conditions are not present in that. You have to contextualize the entire discourse that you are getting from, let's say, a chatbot, ChatGPT 4 version or 5 version. You are getting you ask you about who are you, suppose you ask, ChatGPT will give you an answer. Now we look at the answer, what answer he is giving. You ask who is Prosenjit Biswas, ChatGPT will give you an answer. You ask what teleparallel universe is all about, ChatGPT will give you an answer. You ask what is Jaina, Anekantavada or Sayadavada, it will give you an answer. Now you look at the way corpuses have been brought together. Can it be disambiguated, retranslated in our language in which our lexicographer was doing it? That is the precise problem. So where do we move now? We move towards translingualism. Yeah.
So, sir, I have two questions. So, one is about the Jaina idea of inexpressible. So, are you deriving that idea from the sevenfold Saptabhangi? Well, because in that case, the inexpressibility is due to simultaneous non-assertion. It's not because it cannot be known or it cannot be expressed. The inexpressibility is because saha avachyam. So just like yesterday when Professor Bilgrami was saying that you cannot have both the point of view together, that is what the idea of inexpressibility comes out from the Jaina Saptabhangi. So Anekantavada in that sense, I mean, one of the component is inexpressibility, but that's not how inexpressible is usually viewed. So I would like to know your response about that. And in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that Anekantavada is about many truths. Isn't it about reality being multifaceted than truth being multifaceted?
Yeah, last question first. I mean, do Anikantavadins talk about a fixed reality? That's the basic question. What is the nature of reality? Reality has to be transfigured, in a certain discourse, in a certain language. And this process of transfiguring is such that it becomes sayed, You cannot transfigure it as something that is real. So reality cannot be transfigured as reality. That's the answer from Anekantavadi inside. And that goes perfectly well with the current state of science, current state of mathematics, current state of literary criticism, or anything of that sort. All right? That's number one. Number two, what you said about inexpressibility. What is inexpressibility? And that is something very significant for me. Inexpressibility is going beyond expressibility, going beyond categorization, going beyond predication. Now, do we go beyond all this or not? You can restrain yourself that I decide hereforth I will not go beyond anything of this sort. Then you will miss a substantial part of reality, which will appear to you as not only unknown but also unknowable. Now I'm saying in the level of unknown unknowables, let's say COVID virus. It's an unknown unknowable. What can you express? All your expressions are going to be partial and ambiguous as well. So does it mean that we give up on expressions? Yes, we give up, saying that it is inexpressible. But saying that it is inexpressible is the mode of expression that we are currently tom-tomming. All right? This one. Yeah.
Hello. My question is if there is no any absolute truth in this world, so why we need absolute think or absolute mind for that? If there is no absolute think in this existence, so why should we need an absolute think?
Yeah, you can try to construct an absolute thought along with an omniscient absolute thinker. That's perfectly permitted in Anekantavada. So you can have omniscience, okay? But within omniscience, there are gaps. You don't know the human genome fully. You don't know the genomes that have constructed your synaptic connections in your brain. Nor you don't know how a flower is designed in this kind of a symmetric manner. Or you don't know what is time, for example. So your absolute knowledge, supposed to be absolute, is just a presupposition of absoluteness. I'm saying I have no quarrel with such presuppositions. What I'm quarreling is that when you say that your absolute knowledge is actually, really, potentially absolute. Absolute doesn't require these predicaments or predications anymore. Why do you predicate your absolute with something else? Like, for example, the idea of infinity. What is the idea of infinity? Where light bends, that is the point of infinity. As far as I can see, where light bends. And where I cannot see, does light bend there or does light doesn't bend there? So that is the question. Light can bend there or light can remain infinitely linear in a universe which is billions of light years away from us. And mathematically that can be proven by a system that I use here. And it can also be disproven by you by developing a counter system of anti-world or anti-light, whatever. You can have, if you have light, you can also have anti-light. If you have particle, you can also have anti-particle. If you have a world which is clockwise, you can have an anti-world anti-clockwise. Mathematically, all that is possible. So therefore, your absolute is couched into two different kinds of dualism. At one level, you are not able to resolve which side to take. And at another level, you are continually multiplying your dualism in newer terms. And those terms of dualism are becoming our sustenance for carrying on with philosophy and science at this point of time. And that is what is many-sided version of many-sidedness. Okay, so that's it. Sure, please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this whole session, particularly your discussions. I do work a little bit about COVID virus and I have a vaccine that is coming up someday.
Oh, that's very nice.
The idea of time, the philosophy, this anekantbad, it has to be anekant because time is part of the factor. So the moment, even if we don't know anything about genetics, it's just going to be different. Now the question is, there is this ekam sat viprah vaudha vadanti. How is that related to anekantbad? And then this, it's not just only that the expression is very important. The expression is not what I'm saying. I'm only saying words, and we are talking about all this analytic. But before I say the word, there is so much more inside. And there is a communication. I also work with Botox. That's one of my businesses. And one of the things that has come out is that somebody who gets Botox cannot understand what I say. Because to understand, you and I have to resonate. Resonate not only in the words and sounds, but also in your expressions. So it starts from Vaikari, goes to Madhyama, goes to Pashyanti and Para, because that's all existence. So then getting to that level, it becomes a lot more complicated, which is a wonderful reason why are you talking about all this. The last point I want to say, this ekam sat vipra bhavudha vadanti, then there is a Dvij also, and there is Brahman also, and there is Sudra also. It's in us. I don't mean that in terms of caste or something. So those are all the varnas that we talk about. So then there will be a different ekam sat vipra bhavudha vadanti, ekam sat sudra bhavudha vadanti, ekam sat brahman bhavvadanti, or whatever. I think I wrote yesterday about ekam satya Vipra Vaudha Vadanti Ekam Sat Brahm Ekam Vadati. When you say Brahm, you're Aham Brahmans. When it says come to Dvij, because Dvij is supposed to be with the Sanskar, Ekam Sat Dvij, Duvidha Vadanti. And Sudra will be Ekam Sat Sudra Sampurn Vadanti, because Sudra is supposed to know everything. So anyway, I just put this point, communication, and then the time as a factor of changing and how to communicate with these multiplicities that you said, known, known, unknown, unknown, known, unknown, unknown, known, and you said many other indefinite, so many things. Please just comment about these anekantbad and the ekam sat vipra vaudha vadanti.
I mean, your way of fleshing out it in language itself is a case of pluriversality. You are simultaneously talking of what is and what is not, and what is expressible and what is inexpressible. You have simultaneously packed together everything in ekam sadvipra bahuda badanti. Now this ekam sadvipra, and bahuda badanti, do they come together? In what way they can come together? That way is not clear to us. So we run to the saints. They will say that you pursue your line of enlightenment to have that Bahuda Badanti to flourish into Ekam Sad Vipra. Does it flourish into Ekam Sad Vipra, or it flourishes into Bahuda Sad Vipra or Bahuda Ashada Vipra at this point of time? When we say Tamoshama Jyotirgamayo enlightens us to Bahuda Badanti, Bahuda Viprayo at this point of time. It's no longer Ekam Sad Vipra. Ekam Sad Vipra has silently slipped out through our language, and we have crossed that state of Ekam Sad Vipra when we are trying to articulate Ekam Sad Vipra. So we are leading ourselves to a kind of pluriversality, which we are not able to accommodate within our given notions of truth and falsity, also within the body that we have inherited biologically, as if we require an out-of-body mind, an out-of-body brain, if not an out-of-body world and out-of-body experience, to understand this pluriversality, which science is continually leading us to the moment we start doing science, or the moment we start doing philosophy. Because you are from a science background, so I'm saying a kind of multiple interpretation of the same genetic sequence has already happened. We have 3,600 papers telling us about 3,600 versions of the COVID-19 genome. Where is it leading us to? So we are led to a kind of a pluriversal universe, which is more living, more thriving, which is more musical than the music we have ever heard. And that's a different kind of a cosmos in which we are inhabiting all the time. And our feet, the ground below our feet, is slipping away to that pluriversal universe. And this is what is the experience of doing Anekantabada. And this is what is the experience of the saints as well. So this is how you can look at it.
Others have tried their best to make Jaina philosophy as contemporary as possible, because both the indefinite and the inexpressible have a great logical value, also a metaphysical value. So I am really thankful to both the speakers, Professor Chakravarti and Professor Viswas, for their excellent effort to make us understand the intricacies of Jaina logic and metaphysics. I thank the audience and also the participants who really took pains to raise questions and also made our really seminar very fruitful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Now, the next session will be started at 2, and you all are invited for lunch.